It's lovely to see a full set of screens this evening for our virtual tour of Prague with Dr. Charles Landau. Charles is an outstanding historian, tour guide, raconteur, and apparently he's a really good dentist as well, but haven't experienced that side of things. This evening is not only our virtual tour of Prague, but it's also Yom HaShoah. And we're going to begin with a very brief opportunity to say the memorial prayer for the 6 million who perished. And as Charles reminded me just a little earlier, this week on the 11th of April will be the 60th anniversary of the beginning of the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, but fittingly today, the 25th of Nisan, Yom HaShoah, is the 60th anniversary in the Hebrew calendar of the beginning of the Eichmann trial. And the relationship between Eichmann and Heydrich and Prague are doubtless going to be in what Dr. Landau will share with us, though Prague is also very much a historic city of beauty and majesty and Kabbalistic import in the Jewish tradition, and going back many hundreds of years, and we shouldn't just remember it for its recent past and proximity to Theresienstadt. So just to begin now, we will recite the memorial prayer for the 6 million who perished, and then it'll be my great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Charles Landau. El male rachamim, shochen b'maromim, hametzei menucha nechon al kanfei hashechina, b'malot kadoshim utorim, k'zohar ki amazirim et nishmot, sheishet milyonei acheinu ואחיותינו הקדושים והטהורים שהומתו ושנהרגו ושנשחטו ושנשרפו ושנטבעו ושנחנקו על קידוש השם על ידי הצוררים הנאצים ועוזריהם יימח שמם וזכרם. בעבור שאנו מתפללים בעד עילוי נשמותיהם, בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם, לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרו בצורכי מן נשמותיהם, אדוני נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום אל משכבותיהם, ונאמר Amen. O God, full of compassion, who dwells on high, grant perfect rest beneath the shadow of your divine presence, in the exalted places amongst the holy and pure, who shine like the brightness of the firmament, to the souls of our 6 million brothers and sisters, the holy and the pure, who were killed, slaughtered, burnt, drowned and strangled in the sanctification of your name by the Nazis and their associates. We pray for the ascent of their souls to the highest spheres of heaven. May they forever rest in paradise. We beseech you, compassionate Lord, to shelter their souls forevermore beneath your protective wings. May their souls be bound up in the bond of eternal life, for the Lord is their inheritance. May they rest in peace, and let us say, Amen. Thank you very much for that, everyone. And now it is my great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Charles Landau, who is going to present a virtual tour of one of the most beautiful historic cities, significant in the Jewish tradition, in the city of Prague. Over to you, Charles. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you, Rabbi Lawrence, for introducing me, and all the Kinlos who have helped me to put on this evening's presentation and talk on Prague, which will be alongside a show here with slides all the way through. many years ago, Dvorak, one of the two great Czech composers, was greatly, more or less in love, as he said, with Wagner. He said, I was perfectly crazy about him. And it would be Wagner, the composer, who would in fact add the music to Lohengrin after a visit to Prague, who would add the words to this particular slide, Splendor and Beauty of Prague, a city beyond compare. Czech Republic. This is a modern map. Czech history is defined by its geographical location on the eastern side of Central Europe. Landlocked, it is surrounded by many great and dangerous countries, including, of course, Germany and Poland and Austria and Hungary. And alongside its history, the Czech area would be divided into Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia. It had been part of the Holy Roman Empire, part of the Austrian Empire, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then would be part of the German Empire, so to speak. After 1918, it would contain many ethnic groups, including Jews. German was the language of culture. German was the language of literature, and most of the Jews who wanted to advance within Czech land would in fact learn and speak German as a first language, but that did not make them any more German than the Germans that lived there. And then these Jews would in the main live here in this capital city of Prague until at one time they would be more than 25% of the population. The wonder of Prague is that it's a city of fact and fiction, of myth and mythological stories. Every single nuance of Prague is touched by the mythological. Every nuance of Prague is touched by stories which emanate from different areas and all come together within the Jewish milieu. Many of them, or some of them, contain an element of truth, but many of them are pure imagination, but today are viewed as essential part of Czech and Prague history. In front of us, we have here a map which is of the Jewish area. If we look to the map which you have in front of you, you will see that here, if you can all see my pointer moving around, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stars of David, which represent the 6 synagogues which remained after the beginning of the 20th century. These 6 synagogues make up what is known as a museum, the Jewish Museum. They are not individual synagogues, but they are part and parcel of this unique museum for how many museums spread over a large area and contain many different areas. Very few people go to Prague, Jews, non-Jews, who don't go to Josephov, who don't go to the Jewish quarter. For this is one of the most powerful, one of the most splendid, one of the most mythological areas of the whole of Prague, as it does lying on the side of the Vltava or the Moldau River, which you can see in front of you as it sweeps along. And there at the bottom here is the Charles Bridge, which we will come to later on. Jewish history in Prague was similar to Jewish history in most other capital cities and in fact cities of Europe over the 1,000 years from the end of the 10th century when Jews lived there. There were good times and there were the awful times when Jews were expelled and Jews were burnt at the stake and Jews were accused of blood libel. And yet in between that, by the 16th century, the Jewish area here would develop and explode in an era or a golden age of Prague Jewry. We would produce the Prague Haggadah, The book read on Seder night, the first night of Passover, with its beautiful printing and woodcuts. And then the synagogues would, one by one, all these ones would be built over a lengthy period of time. Prague Jewry would continue and ever increase. And then to the period tonight we've already mentioned, and we're commemorating tonight, 1,000 years of Jewish history would come to an end. Now here we have two pictures on the right-hand side. This is what Prague Jewish area looked like prior to redevelopment. Here the Jews were accused in living in cramped quarters, and many stated, in fact, they created the first skyscrapers because the Jews were restricted always to a particular area, not being allowed to live outside of that area. They would therefore build upwards. By building upwards, they would become more cramped. The area would be stuck in poverty. It would be unpleasant. And by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, this whole area, if you can see in these photographs, would be ripped out, not as any way because they wanted to move the Jews, but they simply wanted to move out the worst part of town and to improve conditions. There were many great personalities in many great cities. What's interesting about Czech and Czechoslovakia is that the number of rabbis that actually dwelt in this particular land were few and far between. But one of the greatest of all rabbis of whole of Jewish European history was Rabbi Judah Loew. And he was known as the Maharal of Prague, and he would be a great philosopher, educator, inspirer, and he would be the beginning of many of the myths and the legends and the stories which would encompass the Jews of not only of Prague, but gradually to this day of the whole Jewish world. Rabbi Loew would write exclusively on many topics, and he would find himself a man of passionate principles. And therefore, when he tried to become the chief rabbi of Prague, he was rejected. He was too outspoken. He spoke against the Lashon Hara. He spoke against needless and causeless hatred caused by gossiping. He would speak out against other aspects of the community which he didn't approve of. He would speak out against what people drank, the type of wine they had, and would find himself in dispute often with others such as the Ramor, Rabbi Moses Isserles in Poland, and they would sharply disagree on certain topics. But he would also be, as a philosopher and a writer and a mystic, his educational ideas were 500 years ago and yet were right up to date. And he was most insistent that when you try and teach children, you don't start with the most advanced ideas, but you start with the basic. And when they've conquered the basic, you move on. And when they've conquered that, you move on, etc. He became a friend and a mystic to Rudolf, who was the emperor of the time in that area. And it's said that when the Maharal wanted to meet with Rudolf, and Rudolf agreed to meet him on the bridge over the Tava River, that the horses came along and Rabbi Loew with mystical powers would stop the horses, and that the Rudolf would say to him, and very impressed by him, would want to know of his philosophical slant. This statue is of Rabbi Loew. It is treasured not only by Jews, it is treasured by Czechs and people in Prague, and it is by the new town hall. And it was removed and preserved during the Second World War. It is enormous in height, rising to some 6 meters. And Rabbi Loew here is in the middle of a mythological story that Saloon, who created this, actually represented in this strange statue. For here we have one of the most revered rabbis, and yet if you look to the right of the rabbi is a young naked woman. To the other side is a dog. Why would a rabbi have a young naked woman to one side and a dog to the other? It is said that Rabbi Lowe, due to his spirituality, he believed that his mystical slant on life and his spirituality would prevent him from dying. And as long as he kept learning, he would never die. He would spend his time in his books, and that would keep him living. One day, so the story goes, his granddaughter came to him with a rose, and he leant down to take the rose from his granddaughter. And as he took the rose up to the nose in order to smell the fragrance of that particular flower, the angel of death, as it were, entered into him and he died. Why Saloon represented the person, the granddaughter of a naked young girl, is within Saloon's imagination. But you can see the way the Maharal, Rabbi Lowe, is holding up his hand, rejecting the flower, knowing that this could in fact affect his very life. His right hand is held to his body, and the dog by the base of the statue is said to represent the Jewish community who are kept like dogs. But if that isn't enough, the Maharal, Rabbi Lowe, would become associated with the Golem of Prague. And today you cannot go to Prague without stopping at every other restaurant, which is called the Golem restaurant. You can have a Golem ham sandwich. You can have a Golem fish pie. You can have a Golem model, a Golem, whatever you want. The Golem of Prague is absolutely essential to the history of Prague itself. The idea of man being able to create another person is and has hints of it in the book of Psalms, in the Talmud, in a book of creation, but it's mainly a story which is developed by the Grimm brothers in the 19th century, especially Jacob Grimm. And by 1847, this story, mid-19th century, is part and parcel of Prague history. And it is said that the remains of this golem are still there in Prague, and we'll come on to that in a moment. So where does the Maharal come into it? Where does Rabbi Lowe come into the story of the golem? Everybody knows that the golem is associated with Rabbi Lowe, but let me assure you, Rabbi Lowe never, ever knew of anything to do with the golem. It is what is known as pseudepigraphical. It is a writing falsely attributed to somebody famous in order to bring out a lot of fame for the story. Now, what's interesting about the golem, which they notice in this idea of creating a body out of mud of the river, is that on it are three Hebrew letters, an aleph, oops, go back one, an aleph, a mem, and a taf. And there is the word truth. The word in Hebrew is truth. But when the golem ran amok, we find that the golem had the first letter of the word rubbed out. And so the Hebrew went from a word meaning truth to a word meaning death. And therefore the golem collapsed. And that is where we come on to another story to do with the Maharal, Rabbi Lowe. This synagogue in Prague, as can be seen today, is known as the Alt Neu Shul, or the Old New Shul, the Old New Synagogue. There are differences of opinion as to why it's called this, but there are different ideas. But it is said this shul was built, or we know it was built in around the year 1270. It is the oldest extant still used synagogue in Europe. And only when the whole area was cleared out of the slum dwellings at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, the Altneuschule remained. And this street next to it is this narrow street, is the only street from the tearing down days. This is an original street from the old ghetto of Prague. The Altneuschule is also possibly known as Altenai Shul, which means on condition, for there's a mythological story that the synagogue is built on stones from the temple, and the Altenai means on condition. And the condition is that when the Messiah comes, the stones of this synagogue would return to Jerusalem. This synagogue is absolutely beautiful to enter into. But there are many others which make, and it is said that in the roof is where the golem is this day, still there. The Nazis, when they came along, on 2 separate occasions, attempted to blow up this synagogue. On the first occasion, they put dynamite around the synagogue and underneath it. And the rabbi there leading the service said, under no condition does anybody move, because if they had moved, they would have been shot by the Nazis when they left the synagogue. And it was that when they attempted to blow it up, it didn't work. It failed. And the Nazis left it alone, and it survived throughout the war. Now, the Museum of Prague, the Jewish Museum of Prague, has many synagogues. This is the Pinkas synagogue. It has obviously been revamped. It is the second oldest synagogue in Prague. It's Gothic and Renaissance style, and it was built originally around 1535. Today, like most of the synagogues of Prague, they are museums because the number of Jews that are remaining in Prague are few and far between. And today, every one of 77,297 victims, I've rounded it up to 80,000 here, of 77,297 victims of the Holocaust are mentioned area by area and name by name. And the last tour I took to Prague, one of the people on it went through the list here, and she found the names of her grandparents that had been murdered. There were some 82,000 sent away from Bohemia and Moravia, the Czech area. 71,000 were murdered in concentration camps, and 7,000 were murdered in Prague itself. And all the names, and people spend a lot of time going through here to see, as well as that, within the synagogue are also some of the 4,500 paintings which were done by an art teacher when they were in Terezin or Teresian stuff. They're also to be seen. As we move on, there are other then famous synagogues. Here we have the Meisel, the Clausen, and the Spanish. The Spanish synagogue, as you can see, was for Sephardim from the Byzantium area. And this is built on the oldest synagogue, which is no longer there, which was known as the Altschul, the old synagogue. It is in beautiful Moorish style, reflecting the Spanish background to this particular synagogue and period. All these synagogues were used by the Germans during the war for storage. The question here is that here we have a building, a synagogue, the Clausen, which has within it the burial society of the community. But you'll notice here steps going up. The cemetery is above the level of the street. Why? And this is the old Jewish cemetery. This is one of the most famous cemeteries in the world, Jewish cemeteries in the world. It is not the largest cemetery in the world, Far from it. They're much larger in many other cities, such as Warsaw or Berlin. But what is special about this is who is buried within it and the type of, and the hundreds of years it goes back, and its haphazard arrangement of the tombstone, and the fact that it is higher above the street, because in this particular cemetery, people are buried in layers 12 deep. So one is buried with a gap, and then another, and another, and another, and another, to be 12 deep. When they rebuilt much of Prague, much of this cemetery was cut off, and many of the tombstones were brought back within it. Many famous Jewish personalities are buried here. There's David Gans, the historian. There are printers. There are Meisels of the synagogue, which I saw. And most famously is Rabbi Lowe himself. And this beautiful, absolutely beautiful tombstone, which is erected both for himself and for his wife. On the right is the burial place of his wife, and on the left is that for himself. Here we have a lion. His name was Judah, Rabbi Judah Lowe, and we have here a lion of Judah, but it also represents the lion of Bohemia, where there's also a lion, and there is the use. Many of the tombstones will have different objects on them reflecting things which are trying to say. The person was a scribe, the person was a Levite, the person was a Cohen, the person, and many other things. The person was a teacher. And here, these are grapes, and invariably within Czech lands and in other countries, grapes represent the idea of the land of Israel. Because when the spies came back to the land of Israel, they brought with them clusters of grapes. And you can see there he lived from 1525 to 1609. One other person who is part and parcel of the very fabric of we now come to the modern period, who was born at the end of the 19th century and died in 1924, of course, is Kafka. How many greater writers are there within Europe than Kafka? And the statue which is here, which is just by the Alt Neue Schule, by the Old New Synagogue, is, of course, Kafkaesque in its appearance, which is where the word, of course, comes from. It is slightly bizarre. It has a man sitting on the shoulders of somebody else, a gaping hole, and there are holes for his arms, but there are no feet, and there are no hands either. Kafka means a jackdaw, a type of bird. He was a classical Jewish member of Prague society, a part of that Jewish world where they knew German first, and he studied law. He hated law. He then he was an unusual personality. He was a bit schizoid, he was a depressive, he was a bit suicidal on occasions as well. But he spent some 14 years then working, and he's not the only author who did this, many others did as well. Kafka worked for 14 years in the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute. He had one main friend who was Max Brod. Max Brod was his closest friend. And they were together all the time discussing his works and his books and his writings. And Kafka asked of Max Brod, when he became ill in 1924 and he was dying, he asked Max Brod to destroy all of his works, all of his documents, all of his letters, all of his writings. He didn't want anything to survive. And up to then, only one book, Metamorphosis, had actually been published. Kafka was little known, little appreciated, and he was certainly totally unknown in the English-speaking world. He never married. He was conflicted with his identity, a German speaking in Prague. He was conflicted with his father. He was conflicted with his Judaism. He wrote one of the longest letters you would ever see to his father, where he was conflicted with the woman who looked after him and used to take him to school. And he had real problems with his Judaism. And he asked his father, and he was part of that generation who felt a distance from Judaism, as the society in which they lived wanted them to become distant from Judaism. And he wrote to his father, and he said in the classic sense, you want me to be something partly Jewish, you want me to be that, but you give me nothing. Your Judaism, he said, has, quote, dribbled down to me, and you fought me, and you go to synagogue 4 times a year, and that's all you do, and you expect that I should carry it on. But Kafka was always proudly Jewish nonetheless. What is interesting is that way after his death, there was a claim Max Brod did not destroy any of his documents, did not destroy any of his works, and later on would take them, they would be taken to Israel, and there would be there's a book called The Last Trial of Kafka, which is the trial which took place in Israel on who can claim the right to all the writings of Kafka. You have to read his books to see how Kafkaesque and strange they are. What is finer than reading the trial, which many people say reflects an authoritarian society and could be later on the Nazi society, where a person is arrested for a reason he doesn't know. He's accused of a crime which he doesn't understand and he doesn't know about. He's then put through the law and the trial when he doesn't know why he's there. And eventually he dies for a crime that he never knew he committed because he knows nothing about it. Is a book worth reading? It would be much later on that his work then translated to English, and he would go from hardly anyone knowing of him to becoming one of the most popular classical writings of our time. Today, there's Metamorphosis, which is published during his lifetime. The Castle and the Trial, of course, were published after he died. There hasn't been for many years, but there is now a Kafka museum. It is all in black, it is very dark, and it's really Kafkaesque. And it's very easy to get completely unaware of where one is when one is wandering through it. The Charles Bridge. When you go to Prague, nobody goes to Prague without seeing the Charles Bridge and probably walking across. It's wide, it's 33 foot wide and nearly 2,000 foot long. It is a beautiful, stunning bridge. And it is one of the 18 bridges which cross the Moldau. Poltava, the two names, the Czech name, and the Moldau, the German name for it. What's interesting about the Charles Bridge is that it has on it some 30 statues, 15 on the north side and 15 on the south side, different statues. Most of them of a saintly manner, and most of them produced for part of the worship of Christianity and the adornment of Christianity. I had a cab there once, and the cab driver told me that these were all original statues. Unfortunately, the cab driver, who was Czech, didn't know that not one of them is original. The Charles Bridge has been subjected to floods and more floods and fires and more floods, and then ice, and then many other things. It has collapsed and been rebuilt and reconstructed. Statues have collapsed and been replaced. And today, most of the originals are in a museum. When was it built? Well, it was built in 1357. For all of you with the Greek knowledge, this is a palindrome, a mathematical palindrome. We're familiar with the word palindrome, race car, Hannah, Abba, the group that is. And all of those are, you read it, what a palindrome means in Greek is to read it again or backwards. and they all read backwards. Hannah goes one way and back again. And you'll notice here that it's a palindrome. But as you enter onto the bridge to the right-hand side, in fact, just by the toilet over there is this palindrome is on the wall. 135797531. Unless you know what it is, you just think they're a sequence of numbers. But when the Charles Bridge was built, Charles IV had this built, and it's built on top of the Judith Bridge, which existed before it. So underneath there would have been the Judith Bridge, which collapsed and Charles came on top. This then is 1357. And it is that in the year 1357, on the 9th of July at 5:31 in the morning, the first stone for the new bridge was laid. And he took his advice from astronomers and other people, astrologers, who gave him advice when to do it, and that it was good idea to do that. And so this particular palindrome is there to tell us exactly the time of the first stone. Here you have in front of you Calvary and crucifix, or crucifix and Calvary. The statue here is obvious to everybody. It is one of the first statues you come across as you come across the Charles Bridge, and it is on the right-hand side, on the northern side. And it is a classic crucifixion scene, seen a million times over in the Christian world, and with a classic I-N-R-I, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, over above it. And this statue has gone from being, this is one of the oldest, it's not the original, and even the one was put on was not original. There were other statues there beforehand. And it goes back to a story of 1696 to a Jew known as Bachofen. So the story goes, because naturally you're asking, why is there Hebrew around a crucifix? What can that possibly mean? Why would Jews want Hebrew over a crucifix? It's the end of the 17th century. It is said, again, it's a story, another story, mainly true, but there are a couple of different stories. Bachofen was coming across the bridge. He'd had a particularly bad day, and as he goes past the crucifix, he sort of murmurs disquiet with Christianity. Oh, the crowd hear him, and they chase him to the ghetto just over the river. And they say, give him up to us. You're going to hand him over. He is insulted Christianity. You're to hand him over. And the ghetto elders refused. But as a punishment, they were made to establish there in Hebrew and pay for it the words, which is one of the holiest lines from the book of Isaiah, which makes up the centrality of the service, the additional service on all holy days within the Jewish world. And it says in Hebrew, Kadosh, Kadosh, look to the other side, Kadosh, Hashem, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And this has been taken over by Christianity and included in their Eucharist service. That's the bread and the wine, the Eucharist service. So they made them take a sentence from Isaiah chapter 6 and place it over a crucifixion. Now today, when it was put back, this was removed during the Nazi period. In fact, it was put back with the Aleph. The letter there is upside down. It's upside down. Maybe they did deliberately. Bring it up to date. At the end of the last millennium, and in the last 20 years or so, a rabbi from America noticed this, and he felt great disquiet. He felt that this was a continuation of Christian anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, and it's enough is enough. 2,000 years would seem to be plenty. And he approached the authorities and he said, this isn't right. There was no attempt to pull down the statue. There was no attempt to throw the statue in the river. but they have placed, which you can't see, but it's in the bottom right-hand corner, in the year 2000 to 2009, 2 plaques have been placed explaining exactly how this comes about. And that it should be viewed as a piece of unfortunate Christian history, which we've moved on from. This is a statue here of St. Cyril and Methodius. It is not an original one. There were other statues there, and this was added, as you can see here, in 1928 to 39. Cyril and Methodius are said to be the saints who brought Christianity to the Czech areas, Moravia and Bohemia, and to Prague. But we'll see why they are important in a couple of moments. We now come to the war. In 1938, as a British government and Chamberlain, through a policy of appeasement, were about to sacrifice first to Datenland, which is the area here on the outskirts of the map here. And they were about to sacrifice the whole of Czechoslovakia on the belief that there would be peace. They can see what is remarkable about this map and being pointed out. Look closely at the Größe Deutschland here, Germany and Austria. It looks like the head of a dog, and it is his mouth is enclosing Czechoslovakia into it. It is in the mouth of a dog or a wolf. In 1938, the Munich Agreement. In October 38, Sudetenland was gone, and in March 1939, Czechoslovakia was occupied by the Nazis. After a while, Reinhard Heydrich would become the deputy Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia. That's the part of Czechoslovakia here, which is in the mouth of the animal. And Heydrich was a particularly nasty, antisocial, psychopathic individual. He was a classic Nazi. He was tall, Aryan-looking, slanted eyes, blonde hair, and he was Himmler's right-hand man. There was Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich. And at Heydrich's right hand was Eichmann. And Eichmann and Heydrich would move together. He was arrogant and cynical. He would enact torture and killing on people without any qualms whatsoever. He would be responsible for Gleiwitz. Eventually, when the First World War would be declared, the Second World War would be declared, when he would enact a fake invasion by the Poles on Gleiwitz, which was a German station, as it were. He would become known for Operation Reinhardt. That Operation Reinhardt was a scheme to murder 3 million Jews of Poland. And he would attend the Wannsee Conference at the beginning of 1942, Wannsee in Berlin. And there he, with Eichmann at his attendance, they would enact not the final solution, which had already been decided upon, but the exact detail of the final solution, the bureaucratic aspect of the final solution, and who was to be counted as a Jew. Czechoslovakia is now being swallowed up, and the Jews are being compressed. And the Czechoslovak government in exile in Britain feels that surely they need to react. And a scheme was established by SOE to assassinate Heydrich in what was known Operation Anthropoid in 1942. Now, why anthropoid? Because anthropoid is a false human being, a machine-like person, which is how Heydrich was seen. And there they sent over a Czech and a Slovak, who were sent over by SOE and dropped into Czechoslovakia. They landed in the wrong place, but they got there. And with those there to help them, they arranged to assassinate in different places. And eventually they were going to assassinate him as he came round a bend. As they came round a bend, one of the two people came at him with a Sten gun which froze. And Heydrich, instead of ordering Klein, his chauffeur, to drive on at speed, decided with his arrogance, he didn't even have a covered car, that he would fire back. And he shot back at the man, but his gun froze as well and didn't work. And at that moment, the other assassin threw a grenade under the rear aspect of the car, which blew the back wheel off and part of it and thrust much of the debris and the horsehair of the seat into Heydrich. Heydrich jumped out of his car to chase the gunman and then collapsed. He would die a painful, fortunately, a very painful death, although at first he thought he was going to recover. The vengeance by the Nazis was immense. Hitler, remember, the Czechs themselves, those living in Prague, had not been in favor of Anverboy. They'd asked for it, in fact, not to take place because they knew the Germans would enact vengeance. And they therefore, Hitler wanted to just wipe out Czechoslovakia. So that didn't take place, but they did round up many, many thousands of Czechs, and many were murdered, famously in Lidice, where men, women, and children were massacred. If you go to the church of St. Cyril and Methodius today, you will see in the crypt is where the assassins of Heydrich held out. This is the view of going on at the time, pumping water into the crypt as the Germans tried to force them out. And these are the bullet holes around that area there, which are still there today. The two assassins and others shot themselves, took poison, or by any method after having fought for a long while. Another great story of there is here from the Second World War is a book you must go and read if you haven't, is Mendelssohn on the Roof by Yuri Weil. Now, he himself was a survivor during the war. When he was meant to be shipped off to Terezin, he decided to go into hiding. He survived the war, and then many years later, and only now did he become well known. And the story begins that on the Rudolfinum, the great opera house and art center by the river, that the Nazis were going to have a great Nazi occasion and said that any statue on the roof of Jews had to be removed. And that was of the musician of Mendelssohn, who would be counted in Nazi eyes as a Jew. And Mendelssohn, of course, the two men get on the roof, but they don't know what Mendelssohn looks like. So in his story here, at the beginning of his book, the two soldiers asked their commander, how do we know which one is? We don't know who he is. And when they appealed to the rabbi to tell them, he didn't know either. And so they said, it's obviously the one with the biggest nose. So they go and they put ropes around the statue with the one with the biggest nose. And of course, the one with the biggest nose was Wagner, a hero of the Nazi party. And this is how the book on the history of the Jews of Prague begins. It is well worth reading. Just to slightly ruin the story, there never was a bust of Wagner on the top of the Rudolfinum, which is here, built in 1885, a beautiful building, and the statues around the top. As we come towards the conclusion of the talk, let us end on a more positive note. One of the great stories of the Holocaust, as we'll see, it's a great story soon. There is a thing called the Museum of an Extinct Race, that the Nazis wished to establish a museum of an extinct race, that somehow they were going to collect all items to do with Jews and hold them till all the Jews were killed, and then they could have some sort of museum showing why genocide was justified against such a perverse lot. And they collected into this museum hundreds of objects from all round Czechoslovakia. And 130 synagogues were emptied and poured into 40 warehouses in Prague. And here we have 1,564 Torah scrolls, the Old Testament, the holiest object in Judaism, which are treated with great dignity. And they were recovered. Now, Many said this was why so there was a Jewish museum there anyway, and they were collecting objects, and the Nazis fed into it. After the war, with a beautiful story, a philanthropist belonging to Westminster Synagogue, which is near Harrods, a very prestigious, tiny liberal synagogue, decided that they were going to bring the scrolls to London and distribute them. And in 1964, they did that. One day, a man, a scribe, a David Brand, he wanders past and he says, I'm a scribe, and scribes are used to repair when letters have been torn, where sections have been ripped, where part of the parchment isn't perfect. And he said, do you have any scrolls I've got no work. Do you have any scrolls I could personally work on? They said to him, we got scrolls you can work on. And he started working, and he worked there for 20 years. When you leave Prague, you go to the other side of Prague, and you go to the Jerusalem synagogue. It's in Jerusalem Street. It's a beautiful, beautiful synagogue, as you can see, stunning. And it is right by, if you come to the end of Jerusalem Street, you come to the statue of Woodrow Wilson. In 1918, Woodrow Wilson came forward with his 14 points, which were decried by many of his allies, and also was responsible in many ways for the structure and the building up of what would become Czechoslovakia. And it is opposite this beautiful, beautiful Art Deco station, which at one time was known as the Wilson Station. So when you've wandered across from near where Kafka used to have coffee, you go to the Jerusalem Synagogue, you come and see the Wilson statue, you go into the Art Nouveau station, and you then wander through it, and you come to a statue of course, Nicholas Winton. Nicholas Winton was a German Jew. He came to Britain with his parents, and they changed their name to Winton from the third time. And they came there, and he went into banking. At one particular point before the war, he was called by a friend who said, we have to do something. We have to save Jewish children. The future is awful. We have to save Jewish children. And Nicholas Winton, quietly and with no one knowing, and out of his normal way of life, rescued 669 Jewish children in what was known as the Czech Kinder Transport, and brought these children to England. I urge you to go and watch, when we finished on YouTube, Esther Ransom's That's Life in 2008, where she interviews Nicholas Winton. He's sitting on the front row of the audience, and she said to him, I want to introduce you to a lady who says you saved her. And the lady stares up and kisses his hand and kisses him and says, you saved my life. And Esther Ransom turns to the audience and says, is there anybody else in the audience who was saved by Nicholas Winton? And every single person in their hundreds stands and up. For everyone in that audience was saved by Nicholas Winton. It is an absolutely tear-jerking moment. It is said in the Bible that people have long lives for, among things, honoring their parents. Nicholas Winton honored humanity, and he too had a long life. He lived to 106, and his statue by Flor Kent is there on platform 1 of the main Prague station. You can even read about him if you go to Temple Fortune. There, more or less on the doorstep of so many of you, is a memorial to Nicholas Winton that says exactly what we have said. It is chilling that of the Nazi dream of creating somehow a Jewish fairyland. Unfortunately, it came true. For Prague today, there are buildings, but there are very few Jewish people. But it is a history remarkable and wonderful, and full of memories and full of heroes. And one of them was Nicholas Winton. Thank you very much.